The village of Dalton is more than $3.5 million in the hole. Mayor Tiffany Henyard is accused of misusing money, and today she's nowhere to be found.
Very, very diligently, very hard under difficult circumstances to get as much information as we could to share with you.
She thinks she's going to jail. I'm also a former Cook County Sheriff for the Department of Corrections, and I suggest that she go and take a tour of that facility so she can see what's in store.
Mayor Tiffany Henyard's rise to power has been nothing short of controversial. While corruption in positions of authority is nothing new, Henyard's actions have elevated to unprecedented levels. Now, she's dealing with the fallout of her decisions as the consequences of her corruption begin to close in on her. Despite her numerous strategies to evade accountability over the years, nothing seems to be working in her favor anymore. The origins of what many call the Tiffany corruption scandal go back to her selection as mayor, which itself was a politically charged decision. The story begins with the sudden passing of the late Mayor Frank Zuccarelli, leaving his position open. The Thorne Township Board of Trustees was tasked with selecting a replacement for Zuccarelli's remaining term, following state election rules. They were given just 60 days to make their choice. Among the frontrunners for the role were Jerry Jones, a trustee and the township assessor, and Joyce Washington, a long-serving trustee who also held the position of interim supervisor. However, the board struggled to reach a consensus on a single candidate. In a surprising turn of events, it was revealed that Henyard had applied for the position some time before, and ultimately, she was nominated as a last-minute option. Her selection wasn't the result of popular consensus or merit. It was a product of political maneuvering, and her choice was seen as a desperate attempt to break the deadlock. Trustees were facing a midnight deadline, and with time running out, they voted her in. In fact, Henyard was sworn in shortly before midnight, after a motion to nominate her was made by trustee Christopher Gonzalez. Gonzalez later admitted that he wasn't even sure Henyard was the most qualified applicant, but with the clock ticking down, he hoped that the urgency of a decision would push the board members to put aside their differences. "I don't know about you, but I don't want the township electors to make this decision," Gonzalez remarked, acknowledging the board's division and the looming deadline. He essentially threw his support behind Henyard, not necessarily because of her qualifications, but because of the pressure to make a quick decision. In the eyes of many, this last-minute nomination should have served as a warning sign that the process was rushed. With little regard for what was best for the township, Henyard's reaction to her appointment seemed almost disconnected from the circumstances surrounding it. When asked how she felt, she responded with a sense of joy and pride, despite the chaotic circumstances. "I'm overjoyed, even though I didn't anticipate it. I adore it, since it shows how fortunate I am and how much I love everyone," she said, as if unaware of the political maneuvering that had led to her selection. Despite the doubts surrounding her appointment, Henyard was quickly thrust into the role of mayor. Her first meeting was typical of many new officials. She spoke about the importance of serving the people and maintaining fiscal responsibility. "I want you guys to know that I appreciate the confidence that you have restored in me to lead such a big path of the late Frank Zuccarelli," she stated, emphasizing her commitment to the public and her role as a servant to the community. However, soon after assuming office, Henyard began to make a series of controversial decisions. Rumors circulated that she harbored personal animosity toward those who had assisted Frank Zuccarelli in his tenure as mayor. She appeared to distrust those with long-standing ties to the township, claiming that their experience and attempts to guide her through her responsibilities only caused her anxiety. This sense of insecurity seemed to drive Henyard to assert control over the situation, which led her to start removing key personnel. The first significant move was the removal of Jessica Jones, a decision that was made quickly and with little explanation. Trustee Jerry Jones motioned to dismiss her, and Trustee Joyce Washington seconded it. The decision was approved unanimously by the board, including trustees Christopher Gonzalez and G.R.Y. Everett. But Henyard didn't stop there. Her next target was Stephanie Whitman. Once again, the resolution to remove Whitman was introduced by Trustee Jones, seconded by Washington, and ultimately passed. The vote, however, wasn't as unanimous this time. Trustee Gonzalez stood alone in opposition, a rare moment of dissent amidst the rapid decision-making. Whitman's removal was particularly upsetting to those involved, as one employee later texted Whitman to express sympathy for the decision. "I'm so sorry they let you go," the message read. Whitman was left confused and hurt, having been given no clear explanation for her dismissal. She reached out to Henyard's office to seek answers, but was left waiting for a meeting that never seemed to come. The lack of transparency around the dismissals only fueled suspicions that Henyard was operating with her own hidden agenda at this point. Henyard's leadership style was becoming increasingly erratic, characterized by her need to eliminate anyone who posed a potential challenge to her authority. Despite being thrust into power under questionable circumstances, Henyard seemed intent on consolidating her control, regardless of the fallout. The more she exerted power, the more controversial her actions became despite her confidence. Henyard's leadership is now facing severe consequences. The once dismissed whispers of corruption have grown louder, as more and more people begin to question her decisions and motivations. What began as a rushed appointment driven by political necessity has now spiraled into a scandal that threatens to consume not just Henyard but the entire township as the walls close in on her. The question remains, will Mayor Tiffany Henyard be able to outmaneuver the forces working against her, or will she finally be held accountable for her actions? The consequences of her rise to power have only just begun to unfold, and the future of Thornton Township hangs in the balance.
Confidential, sensitive papers that were in a common area.
This morning, some of those documents were gone.
Due to the intense scrutiny and controversy surrounding her recent actions, Mayor Tiffany Henyard's attempts to defend herself have only raised more questions than answers. In a public statement, Henyard dismissed Assessor Elson's objections to her leadership, claiming they were an exaggerated response to insignificant issues. She insisted that changes made to the office space were essential, stating that the heat was interfering with her ability to work effectively. Critics quickly pointed out the glaring absence of any official announcement or documentation supporting the move. But Henyard maintained that the relocation of the assessor's office was part of a larger initiative aimed at prioritizing citizen services. Even Henyard's supporters were divided. While some residents came forward to defend her decisions, others raised concerns about her lack of transparency and consultation. One local even suggested that the media should shift their focus away from critiquing the township's management and instead highlight achievements, like the receipt of the Government Finance Officers Association Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting. This attempt to change the narrative was seen by many as insincere, as it failed to address the underlying issues that were causing growing dissatisfaction within the community. The focus on supposed successes appeared increasingly irrelevant as the public's concerns continued to grow, and the administration's credibility shrank as the pressure mounted. Henyard's responses to criticism took on an increasingly defensive tone, often mixing defensive rhetoric with spiritual undertones. She began to cast her struggles as part of a larger, almost divine battle, portraying herself as a virtuous leader facing adversity from malevolent forces. The rumors surrounding her leadership, including questions about her competence and capacity, only fueled the narrative she was beginning to craft. Her administration's lack of transparency and accountability were seen as major problems, and with each misstep, her hold on power appeared more precarious, adding to the chaos. Henyard's ally, Keith Freeman, made a public outburst in an attempt to shift attention away from the growing criticism. Rather than addressing the issues directly, Freeman criticized the media for not presenting a more positive view of the township's accomplishments. He suggested that the people of Thorn Township would be better off hearing about the positive work being done in the community rather than focusing on what he called petty gossip. Freeman's comments seemed to reflect the administration's growing defensiveness as they tried to paint Henyard's difficulties as part of a divine plan that only she had the strength to endure. In an almost theatrical turn, Freeman remarked, "God doesn't make mistakes. He put the right person here who he knew would do the work, take the lashes, and have the strength to endure it all." His comments mirrored the increasingly spiritual narrative being promoted by Henyard's team. Positioning her as a martyr rather than a flawed leader, Henyard also began using a new strategy to manage the growing pressure, restricting media access and holding private meetings. When reporters were finally allowed into meetings, they found that Henyard would often cut them short as soon as the media arrived. This behavior suggested an intentional effort to evade responsibility and avoid facing tough questions from the press. Despite the restricted access, Freeman continued to defend Henyard's actions. He reiterated that there was no misconduct in the office space move and accused the media of focusing on what he called the mess and gossip instead of the more significant issues facing the township. He even claimed that skeptics of the administration were either maliciously targeting the leadership or simply ignorant of the facts to provide some form of reassurance. Freeman offered to provide proof that no private documents or sensitive information had been mishandled during the office move. However, these gestures did little to alleviate the core concerns of local residents and critics, who believed that Henyard's administration was more concerned with appearances than with solving real problems. The shift in office space, which Henyard had framed as part of her commitment to citizen services, became emblematic of the administration's deeper issues. Decisions appeared to be made without transparency or due process, and the lack of clarity only fueled suspicion and frustration as the criticism of her administration continued to escalate. Henyard's shift toward spirituality became more pronounced. She began portraying her difficulties as part of a greater spiritual struggle, claiming that she was a lighthouse of virtue, fighting against dark forces determined to destroy her reputation. This narrative allowed her to position herself as a morally upright individual who was enduring hardship for the sake of her community. Her supporters, particularly those with a strong religious affiliation, may have found this portrayal appealing. But for many others, it seemed like an attempt to deflect attention from her administration's failures by framing her leadership as a test of faith rather than an issue of competence and transparency. As Henyard increasingly used religious language in her speeches, many residents and journalists began to feel that she was deliberately avoiding addressing the tangible issues facing the township. Critics argued that her responses to legitimate concerns about corruption and mismanagement were inadequate, and her administration became known for its opacity, evasiveness, and disorganized decision-making. Despite her claims of working to improve the community, the lack of transparency and accountability in her leadership only contributed to the growing sense that Henyard was more concerned with preserving her public image than with actually addressing the problems her government was facing. The office space shift, which Henyard had framed as a necessary measure to improve citizen services, became a symbol of the broader issues plaguing her administration. The lack of clarity surrounding the decision, coupled with the absence of any formal announcement or documentation, led many to question her judgment. This was just one example of how decisions were being made without due process, further eroding trust in the leadership. Public confidence in Henyard's ability to lead continued to decline as rumors of her incapacity for public office gained traction. The lack of community involvement and her dismissive attitude toward legitimate concerns only worsened her reputation. As her leadership faltered, her ability to effectively govern came into question. The perception that she was unable to handle the responsibilities of her position was compounded by her continued evasiveness and failure to take ownership of the township's growing issues. The most significant shift in Henyard's response to criticism was her attempt to reframe her challenges as part of a spiritual battle. She positioned herself as a virtuous figure being tested by forces beyond her control, a narrative that appealed to some but alienated many others. Critics accused her of avoiding the real issues, instead of addressing them head-on in a transparent and forceful manner. As public dissatisfaction grew, her administration's inability to effectively manage the township's problems became more evident. The defensive tactics employed by Henyard and her team only seemed to widen the divide between the leadership and the residents of Thornton Township. Freeman's increasingly inconsistent defenses painted a picture of an administration on the brink of collapse, desperately trying to maintain its narrative in the face of rising skepticism. Despite their efforts to portray Henyard as a figure of moral fortitude, her attempts to deflect responsibility only served to strengthen the arguments of her critics. As the township continued to grapple with its problems, it became clear that Henyard's administration was more focused on managing its image than on actually addressing the fundamental issues at hand. The growing discontent among residents and the lack of accountability suggested that the leadership was losing its grip on power, leaving Thornton Township to fend for itself amid mounting challenges.
Bald-faced example of Supervisor Henyard's promise of come to the good things, there's so much good going on that we want to tell you about. When we show up to report on it, we were denied access.
So that's what happened to our reporter, and then at the next meeting that you attended, we heard this.
Because y'all don't want to do the research. Y'all keep listening to people and no one's showing you fact. They keep telling you fiction, fake story, fake news, like for real, stop. But go check, guys, if you really want to know the truth so you can understand what it is that we're fighting over.
The drama surrounding Tiffany Henyard's leadership has taken a significant turn as various allegations of corruption, financial mismanagement, and misconduct continue to pile up. The controversy began to escalate when Gonzalez, who had initially nominated Henyard, started to witness how her behavior changed when the cameras stopped rolling. He revealed that from day one, Henyard acted as though she was the one in charge of the show, frequently saying things like, "What are they going to think now?" and "What are they going to say?" in reference to the Dalton trustees. Gonzalez admitted that there had been a rift brewing between him and Henyard, especially after he learned about some of her controversial decisions during her first year in office, which included hiring a criminal inspector who spent taxpayer money without the board's approval and employing Dalton police officers for personal security during the annual meeting. Henyard, a 23-year-old resident of South Holland, had urged township leaders to prioritize civic engagement and make information more accessible to the public. However, things seem to have taken a drastic turn. A resident named Gaswatts voiced frustration over Henyard's handling of the voter rejection of a mental health proposal that would have increased taxes in Thornton Township. I've always been held responsible for my actions and outcomes, and I expect the same of you as a black woman, Watts stated, emphasizing that the issue wasn't about an attack on Henyard's identity, but about the failure to represent the best interests of the residents. Watts also noted, "We are exhausted, not brainwashed. We simply don't trust you to repair the situation." It became evident that Henyard had been making decisions for herself rather than for the people she was supposed to represent. Residents pointed out that she did not want their input on significant decisions and appeared to act without consulting them on matters that affected the community. This sentiment was reinforced by Trinidad, who had initially supported Henyard but later confronted her after witnessing a series of questionable actions. Trinidad claimed that Henyard had avoided discussing important issues and had even made decisions in isolation, disregarding the concerns of the very people she was meant to serve. The sentiment was echoed by Nate Fields, a South Holland resident employed as a photographer for Thornton Township, who was deeply troubled by Henyard's actions. After the sudden death of Frank Zucchi, Henyard allegedly promised Fields that she would support him, but he was fired without clear explanation or cause. Fields expressed his disappointment, stating, "My only goal is to serve my community. When big men approach you and threaten you, it's really frightening. Coming to work makes me nervous. Coming to work shouldn't make me feel afraid." Sources close to Thornton Township employees revealed that Henyard allegedly used male subordinates to intimidate others into silence. Staffers alleged that employees were being harassed by the media as well as the public scrutiny increased. Henyard's leadership quickly became entangled in a web of lawsuits, with multiple legal challenges mounting against her. Her administration's mismanagement and questionable financial practices became a focal point, with local businesses accusing her of unfair practices and favoritism. Employees claimed that they had been wrongfully terminated, often without cause or clear explanation, which fueled further outrage. Perhaps the most glaring legal issue was a lawsuit involving Henyard and Dalton Village trustee Andrew Holmes. The suit stemmed from a Dalton police officer who was part of Henyard's security detail and a former mayor's employee. The case raised serious questions about Henyard's use of public resources for personal gain, further damaging her already tarnished reputation. Additionally, another lawsuit revealed that Dalton officials had improperly denied a business license to a local business owner, and former maintenance manager Dwayne Thrasher filed a lawsuit against Henyard after allegedly being fired while on an authorized vacation for what he claimed were flimsy reasons. The lawsuit demanded that his record be cleared and compensation be provided for wrongful termination, as if the lawsuits were not enough. Henyard's administration faced multiple federal investigations into her actions. The scale of the scrutiny increased dramatically in 2023 when former Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, hired at a rate of $400 per hour, began investigating Henyard's alleged financial mismanagement. Allegations surfaced that Henyard had misused public funds, covering the cost of lavish meals and hotel stays. One of the most troubling aspects of the investigation was the discovery of nearly $900,000 paid to a local prosecutor over a 2-year period. The prosecutor was not authorized to generate criminal charges. Raising red flags about potential corruption. Lightfoot's involvement brought another layer of complexity to the investigation, particularly when reports surfaced that Henyard had attempted to interfere with the federal investigation, accusing Lightfoot of trying to discredit her. Allegedly, Henyard threatened to obstruct any investigative actions, attempting to suppress further scrutiny of her conduct. At the center of the investigation were Henyard and her inner circle, including her political committee, her cancer charity, and her boyfriend, all of whom were facing subpoenas demanding extensive records, including payroll expenses, credit card records, travel details, and other documentation. Henyard's closest ally, Keith Freeman, found himself embroiled in his own legal troubles. Freeman, who had played a significant role in supporting Henyard, was now under investigation for bankruptcy fraud. Reports suggested that Freeman failed to disclose revenue from Dalton, raising serious questions about his financial management. Even more concerning was an audit of Freeman's time as an administrator in Robbins, which uncovered payments that exceeded budgeted amounts. Despite these mounting allegations, Freeman remained in powerful positions in both Dalton and Thornton Township, fueling speculation that he might be negotiating a deal with federal investigators in exchange for cooperation. The pressure continued to mount as former FBI agent Wright suggested that ongoing investigations might uncover additional evidence, informants, and witnesses, deepening the scrutiny on Henyard and her associates. The potential scale of corruption within Henyard's administration was becoming increasingly clear, and the future seemed uncertain for those involved. Henyard's continued defiant posture, including dismissing the allegations as politically motivated and racially charged, did little to calm the growing discontent in the community. Her critics, however, were increasingly focused on the undeniable evidence against her. Henyard's lavish lifestyle and questionable spending patterns became a focal point of the investigation. Over $12,000 in taxpayer-funded travel expenses were racked up in a single year, with Henyard staying at high-end hotels like the Four Seasons in Atlanta, $99,000, and the Marriott Marquis in New York City, $133,000. These expenses, coupled with an additional $26,000 spent on a trip to Las Vegas, raised significant concerns about the misuse of public funds. Critics argued that Henyard had prioritized her personal indulgences over the needs of the community she was supposed to serve, and this financial recklessness painted a stark contrast to her claims of representing the people despite her defiant denials. The evidence against Henyard continued to mount. Her actions suggested that she had been living a lifestyle far beyond what was appropriate for a public servant, particularly when considering the financial struggles of Dalton. Critics began to question not just her leadership but her integrity, pointing out the growing gap between her lavish lifestyle and the needs of the community. Many pointed to her six-figure salary as further evidence that she was out of touch with the realities faced by the residents of Dalton and Thornton Township in the face of mounting investigations and public backlash. Henyard continued to insist that the allegations were politically motivated and racially driven. She accused black trustees in Dalton of betraying their own community and attacking a fellow black woman in a position of authority. However, this narrative was increasingly falling on deaf ears as the evidence of her misconduct became undeniable. Residents and investigators alike were focused on the hard facts, not the accusations of racial discrimination. Henyard's claim that these were fake news, stories, or racially motivated attacks seemed to lose credibility as more details about her spending and decision-making came to light. Her critics argued that the real issue was not her race, but her blatant misuse of public resources for personal gain. Community members who had once supported her were now growing disillusioned, with many demanding that she face the consequences of her actions. The growing pressure for Henyard to resign or face legal consequences continued to mount. Federal investigators were deepening their probe into her finances, and local authorities were beginning to take action. As more revelations about her spending and questionable decisions emerged, the calls for accountability became louder. The scandal surrounding her leadership was reaching a tipping point, and many residents of Dalton and Thornton Township were hoping for a swift resolution to this chapter of corruption and financial mismanagement. For now, Henyard's future remains uncertain, but the investigations into her conduct suggest that the consequences of her actions may be far-reaching. Her time as mayor of Dalton and supervisor of Thornton Township could have lasting implications, not just for her political career, but for the communities she once led. With the full scale of her alleged misconduct now under investigation, many are hoping that this scandal will serve as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the need for transparency and accountability in government. Whether Henyard will face criminal charges or escape prosecution remains to be seen, but one thing is certain. Her tenure as mayor has left an indelible mark on the community she served, one that will be felt for years to come.